Hello and welcome to our program. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we're so glad that you've joined us today for our special program. We are joined by Dr. Andrew Denson, Western Carolina University. The theme of this year's Georgia History Festival is about the importance of place in Georgia. And we're going to be really focusing today on the experience of the Cherokee people in Georgia history, what happened to them, and the way that Georgians have remembered their history and their experience, particularly with removal, coming forward all the way up into the present. I want to welcome Dr. Denson to our program. Andrew, welcome, and thanks so much for being here with us.
Thanks, Dan. It's really good to talk with you all.
Let me give Andrew a quick introduction. As I mentioned, he's a professor of history at Western Carolina University, where he teaches courses on Native American and United States history. He participates in their Cherokee Studies program, as you might expect. He is the author of this book, published by the University of North Carolina Press. It's called Monuments to Absence, Cherokee Removal, and the Contest Over Southern Memory. As I mentioned, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2017. So, Andrew, as I mentioned, the theme, and I'll give the official title here, of the Georgia History Festival for 2021 and 22 is From Marshes to Mountains, Georgia's Changing Landscape, Geography, History, and Community, really talking about the importance of place and the way the land has helped shape community and people over time. So let's start by talking about the Cherokee. If you will, introduce our audience to who the Cherokee people were, fit them into, if you can briefly, Georgia history, and tell us about what happened to them.
Sure. Well, the center of the Cherokee homeland, traditional Cherokee homeland, is in present-day Western North Carolina, so not too far from where I am today, and really where I work here in Cullowhee, North Carolina, is really the very close to the heart of the Jaligiweti, the traditional Cherokee homeland. But that homeland extended into areas that are, that now include parts of northern Georgia, and in fact, areas that are now in northern Georgia became particularly important after the American Revolution and in the early part of the 19th century. During the American Revolution, there's a bit of a, I guess you'd say, a bit of a geographical shift as Cherokees lost land in what's now the upcountry of like South Carolina and in parts of North Carolina. See a little bit of a shift with the center of things moving. I mean, still centered, here in the mountains, but northern Georgia becomes, or what's now northern Georgia, becomes quite significant economically and politically, particularly when the Cherokee National Capital is placed in New Echota, near present-day Calhoun. So land that is kind of claimed by Georgia within its state borders in the early 19th century includes large tracts of Cherokee territory. And then, of course, probably the most famous way in which the Cherokee Nation enters into Georgia history is in the removal era. Georgia, the state of Georgia, the government of Georgia, is the actor that does the most to create a political crisis for the Cherokees in the late 1820s and 1830s that eventually results in the forced migration of Cherokees, most Cherokees, not all Cherokees, but most Cherokees, to the west, to Indian Territory, land that is in the present contained within the state of Oklahoma. So the Cherokee Nation in early Georgia history operates almost as like a antagonist, I guess you would say, to the state government of Georgia. The state of Georgia vigorously pursues the dispossession of the Cherokee Nation as well as, of course, the Muskogee Nation, the Creek Nation. So the presence of the Cherokee Nation is very, very important in early Georgia politics, and removal is a central, pursuing the removal of Native peoples, including the Cherokees, is a central goal of early Georgia.
So because we're talking about the importance of place, how long roughly had the Cherokee people been living in what is now Western North Carolina and northern Georgia? Was this an ancestral homeland that went back centuries, thousands of years? Do we know?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, as far as Cherokees are concerned, this is the homeland, right? The only homeland, the ancient homeland, the continuing homeland. So as I say, the center of things tends to be more in kind of the western part of North Carolina, but in terms of what Cherokees historically and today identify as their homeland, I mean, this is it. Both northern Georgia, the western part of present-day western North Carolina, parts of the upcountry of South Carolina, southeastern Tennessee. This is where creation happens as far as like the oral tradition is concerned. This is from time immemorial, if you want to use the Western term.
Mm-hmm.
So this is it. This is the center of things.
So is it safe to assume then, and not to romanticize any of this, but this isn't that North Georgia, Western North Carolina have been an ancestral homeland of the Cherokee for centuries,
millennia.
And so it's safe to assume that there are Cherokee buried remains still in those areas. If you were walking on the Appalachian Trail, for instance, are you very likely in a place where the Cherokee would have been for millennia?
Yeah, so Cherokee settlements, like most settlements of non-natives in like the early history of North Carolina or Georgia, I mean, tended to be clustered in valleys and places where you could do agriculture. But if you're talking about like the Appalachian Trail or some of the high peaks, I mean, you're sort of looking down upon places that have been inhabited for millennia. Just speaking about the place where I work, Cullowhee, North Carolina. I mean, Cullowhee, we know from archaeology on campus, has really an unbroken history of human habitation that goes back thousands of years. It was a Cherokee town before it was a non-native settlement, but then before it's even the town that ends up being identified as Cullowhee, it's a valley that Cherokee ancestors have lived in for as far back as human history goes. So yeah, these are ancient places. I mean, northern Georgia, western North Carolina. I mean, and really all American places are ancient places. They're all someone's ancestral homeland, someone's ancient homeland.
Describe briefly, then, if you will, the kind of life they lived in these places before contact with European imperial powers.
Sure. So if you're talking about the, what historians call the contact era, so they're the early part of sort of the moment of the beginning of colonization, Cherokee people, like many southeastern peoples, I mean, they would have been living in agricultural villages. I mean, so they're farmers. I mean, I know many of the most popular images of Native Americans in American culture kind of identify Native Americans as being like nomadic or not rooted in the landscape, but pretty much everybody here in the Southeast is agricultural. The corn farmers, although they also use a very wide variety of wild and cultivated plants. So we're talking about agricultural towns. Some of the most important towns are also have at their center sacred earthworks, so mounds. Mounds that support council houses at the center, which are religious and political and social centers of towns. Surrounding those areas, you have houses made of wood and wattle and daub, and then agricultural fields stretching along the creeks and the river bottoms. And so you're talking about a very a farming people, fairly sedentary people. People that use a wide range of other resources, I guess you'd say, in the landscape, but who are very much, since we're talking about place, very much rooted in these specific valleys, these river valleys of like the Tuckasegee, where I work, the Little Tennessee. So this is a world that's defined by these river valleys and by these town organizations, these agricultural town centers.
What role did the Cherokee play in the American Revolution as American colonial settlement begins to creep westward, which of course, I don't think, correct me, but by the middle of the 18th century, it wasn't quite the problem that it would be in the early part of the 19th in terms of Western American settlement. But they did have, like most Native tribes, a key role in the American Revolution, I believe.
Yes, yeah. So, like most of the large Native American nations in the interior of the eastern part of North America, the Cherokees who participate in the American Revolution do so on the side of the British. They're not doing this out of any particular love for the British, although Cherokees had been military and economic allies of British colonies coming out of like South Carolina and Virginia for a relatively long period of time. But Cherokees, those who do participate in the revolution, do so because they're trying to use the alliance with Great Britain to push back against non-native settlement. So this is used as it's a gamble, but it's used as an opportunity to push back against encroaching settlement in places like Western North Carolina or the upstate of South Carolina. This works out very badly, I guess you would say, for Cherokee communities in response to Cherokee attacks on frontier settlements in 1776. North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia send militia invasions into the Cherokee country, really focused on sort of southeastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. And those invasions, those militia forces proceed to essentially destroy everything they can find. There isn't much in the way of fighting. This is about the Cherokee population, large parts of the Cherokee population being put to flight and turned into essentially refugees. And so this is a desperately horrible experience, the revolution in this part of the world. And it's some of the language that you see around, coming out of colonial leaders, coming out of, patriot leaders and the people involved in these militia invasions. It's pretty much genocidal language. They're talking about a need to drive Cherokees from the frontier in order to, as they see it, eliminate a threat in the backcountry during this crisis with Great Britain. So the revolution is just a horrendously traumatic experience for many Cherokee communities. And it goes on, the fighting that's tied to the revolution in the Cherokee country, as in other parts of Native America, goes on even longer than the fighting between the colonies and Great Britain. The Revolutionary War, as far as the United States is concerned, ends in 1783, but there are Cherokees and other Native peoples who are continuing to fight essentially a war that's rooted in the Revolution well into the 1790s. And so it's this long period of warfare that takes just a terrible toll on Cherokee communities and other Native American communities. The Revolution is something of a tragedy for many Native groups who participate not because of any of the issues we usually think about in connection with the Revolution. They participate because they're hoping to use this alliance with Great Britain as a way of protecting their own autonomy, their own freedom, and their own land. So you have this. I sometimes tell students you have a set of Native American struggles for liberty and freedom taking place in the backcountry, but these are being fought against the people we usually associate with sort of the struggle for American freedom.
Yeah. Any idea how many people we're talking about, and not just in North Georgia, but in the eastern or the western part of North Carolina, near where you are? Do historians have any rough guesses as to the size of the population you're describing?
Yeah, so at the time of, trying to think if I can remember the numbers, at the time of removal in the 1830s, you're talking about only 20,000 people, or 15 to 20,000 people still in the Cherokee territory. That's a rebound from the Revolutionary era. So the Cherokee population kind of is restored after kind of a low point in the Revolution. So yeah, those sorts of the numbers you're talking about specifically for Cherokees.
So the Cherokee are allied with the British during the Revolution. They continue the struggle against the Americans, Georgians, as they move west in the years after the Revolution. So describe what happens. Take them up to removal, because by the time of removal, in the American popular imagination, the Cherokee were a very different kind of people than what we traditionally think of, and certainly what we have seen portrayed in popular culture as to what American Indians look like, what they were doing, what their society is like. The Cherokee were very different.
Yeah, so the most famous image of Cherokees in the early 19th century is this idea of like, the civilized tribe, quote unquote, which is a label that's applied by non-natives to Cherokee people, and what that sort of captures is the extent to which not just Cherokees, but many Native Americans who find themselves dealing with the United States in the wake of the revolution begin to make adjustments, essentially, in an effort to find a future in which Native nations can coexist with this new United States, this very vigorously expansive United States that keeps coming back to them, demanding more and more land and putting more and more pressure on them. And so in the early part of the late 18th, early 19th century, the United States encourages cultural, social, and economic changes in its relationships with Native Americans. Cherokees have a reputation historically as being more receptive to those changes. I think in some ways that's a sort of a romantic image, as well as some of the other images that circulate in American culture. So Cherokees tend to, for political purposes, tend to play up the idea that they have adopted elements of Euro-American culture and society and economics in response to these policies that are encouraging those changes. But that's clearly an attempt to mollify the United States and to make the case that the United States can leave the Cherokee Nation alone. And so in the public rhetoric, you often get Cherokee leaders in the early part of the 19th century say, oh, well, we've adopted your style of agriculture, and we've left behind, what they'll say is like, we've left behind the hunt, right? We're no longer following the hunting economy. We're farmers. Of course, they had always been farmers. We're farmers now. We're becoming Christians. You get this playing to that image of the civilized tribe. A lot of things are changing, but it's much more of a selective adaptation. And that's true not just of Cherokee people, but Native groups all through the interior. And the important thing to emphasize is that Cherokees could adopt elements of Euro-American, in particular, economic practices. I mean, that's the most popular adaptation, I guess. Do that without pursuing what non-Indians often think is happening, which is some form of assimilation, right? Some form of acculturation. What you tend to see in the Cherokee Nation and other places is sort of selective adaptation of especially economic practices. Beyond that, during this time, you see Cherokee officials, in some cases, welcoming non-Indian missionaries to come into Cherokee territory and set up schools. This isn't, again, an effort to abandon Cherokee ways, but it's an effort to make sure that some people in the Cherokee Nation are able to speak English, are able to operate successfully in a market economy. It's about adaptation to the presence of the United States generally with, I think, the hope that by adjusting to the United States and by at least trying to convince the United States that Native people are going along with some of its policy agenda, that this will help them to hold on to what they have, right? Hold on to their land, hold on to their political autonomy, remain in, here in the Cherokee homeland. But yeah, things are changing. The economy is changing, especially. You have more Cherokee people who are fluent in English as the early 19th century goes on, some social changes, and then politically, probably the most profound change, politically, you see the Cherokee Nation, Cherokee leaders forming a central government. The traditional political structure of the Cherokee people is fairly decentralized. So towns tended to be more or less autonomous. Different towns, different areas of the Cherokee Nation could act together, but towns tended to be able to follow their own, their own policies basically, and guide their own affairs. In the early part of the 19th century, in response to the United States, basically as a way to try to prevent further loss of land and ultimately to prevent forced deportation, to prevent removal, you see Cherokees creating a central government. And this is the government that ends up briefly being taking New Echota as its capital. But in creating that government, they're attempting to create a political voice that will be able to hold the United States and states like Georgia at bay. So this is an adjustment, and there's a sense among a lot of historians, I think, that while that government is being created in New Echota, at the same time, you still have a lot of really traditional political practices taking place, in more traditional communities. And so you don't want to emphasize too much this sense of change. It's really about adjustment, and adjustment with the goal of holding onto land, protecting Cherokee autonomy.
Okay, were the Cherokee participating in slavery during this period you're describing?
Yes, so during the early part of the 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, you do see some Cherokee families adopting the model of slavery that is already prevalent within the new United States. And there are other forms of slavery. There's captive slavery, the enslaving of Native American captives as part of war. That has a much deeper history, has a history that goes back before European contact. But in terms of the institution of slavery that we generally think of in terms of Southern history, yes, you do see chattel slavery, African American slaves in the Cherokee Nation in the early part of the 19th century.
So is there any discussion or even negotiation during all of this time leading up to the period that we now think of as removal? Was there any discussion between Georgia authorities, U.S. authorities, and Cherokee officials over becoming American citizens? Was that ever on the table? Was that ever a possibility?
So that is generally, in a sense, yes. So there's kind of an expectation that sooner or later, Native Americans are going to kind of blend into the broader American population. That's an aspect of the broader expectation that Euro-Americans always bring, and the United States always brings in the 19th century to Native people, which is that they're going to go away in one way or another, either through displacement or through some form of assimilation. So that those early policies that encouraged cultural and social and economic change, they generally have this assumption that sooner or later, sometime in the future, you're going to see the Native population just kind of being absorbed or sort of dwindling, and eventually whoever's left will become part of the broader United States. But coupled with that, of course, is that this is the early 19th century in the United States, where it's not like there's public acceptance of non-whites as citizens, right? So you had this like dual image where the deeply seated racism of American society is at odds with this assumption of assimilation. And so the idea of Native Americans becoming not citizens, but like equal citizens, that's sort of a remote possibility at best in practical terms. But as like a policy, you do see this expectation that might happen. So it's a strange situation. It's held out as a possibility, but as like a practical thing, it's not really a promise that the United States can fulfill. And then beyond
the idea that they're going to become white is not ever really on the table.
It is and it isn't. So it is in the sense of, like, you'll see intellectuals or policymakers saying that yes, sooner or later their destiny is to become part of the the Great Republic. But in practical terms, I mean, you're talking about a society that is that deeply fears non-whites of all kinds, and that doesn't offer in any sort of like practical way quality. And so it's there, but not as a promise that the United States can fulfill. One sort of side issue to that question: in some of the early treaties in the 19th century with the United States, there is this what one historian has called like an experiment with citizenship. So in the treaties that Cherokee signed in 1817 and 1819. There's this offer that heads of household, that individual Cherokees can enroll and receive individual land holdings. So individual lands, they could sort of choose family lands. And part of this is a promise that they will essentially become state citizens. They'll become citizens of North Carolina or Georgia or wherever. And so there's this experiment in citizenship in those treaties, but what happens in practical terms is that the United States promises this to Cherokee people in those treaties, but the states in which they find themselves living as lands are sold, they don't accept that. And so here in North Carolina, for example, there are these individual land holdings that Cherokees claim all through like the area where I'm now today, including part of our campus. But almost immediately, the state of North Carolina and then land speculators, including many of the people who are like the founders of white communities out here, set out to strip those lands from Cherokees. And so that captures to me this sense that in an intellectual sense, the United States could promise someday equal citizenship. But in practical terms, nobody is offering that, right? In practical terms, and it's very, very clear, I think, to Native Americans that they're not going to be accepted, even if they want to become part of the United States, which are a lot of reasons why you wouldn't in the early 19th century. Even if they want to become part of the United States, that's not, equality isn't something that's going to be offered by the US.
So in many ways, then it's sort of like the African American experience after emancipation, and as we go up through the Jim Crow period, no matter how much education, no matter how much industrial training, no matter how much they're able to sort of become what white Americans think they should be, they are not accepted and are not going to be. So take us through removal, because we want to get to the memory part of this here. But despite having lived here for millennia, this being their homeland, a place central to their identity, Georgians and the United States president and federal government decided they needed to be removed. This happened basically in the late 1830s. Is that correct?
Yeah, although removal as an idea goes back further than that. So Thomas Jefferson in 1803 talks about the possibility of forcing or convincing, I guess is probably how he put it, Native Americans to migrate to the newly purchased Louisiana territory as almost like a byproduct of Louisiana Purchase. So the idea is pretty old. By the 1820s and 1830s, what happens in the 1830s is that it becomes the kind of central goal of American Indian policy, and that's tied to Andrew Jackson's election. Jackson was a longtime removal advocate. When he's elected, he makes, and other Jacksonian Democrats make removal as an official policy one of their primary goals of Jackson's first term. So it's an old idea that then becomes the central focus of American Indian policy in the late 1820s and into the 1830s. And so what the removal policy does is it creates a set of mechanisms for actually carrying out that deportation. As far as Georgia is concerned, this has to do with Georgia's, the boundaries that were established after the American Revolution, which when you look at the map, if you look at what Georgia looks like in 1790, 1800, most of the land that the state of Georgia, or a lot of the land that the state of Georgia claims as Georgia, is in fact Creek territory and Cherokee territory. What this does then is it creates this incredible drive really to possess those lands. This is also encouraged by some of the economic changes of the period, the rise of the Cotton Kingdom, the what historians call the Market Revolution, the economic boom in the early 19th century. And so you have this just incredible pressure for many decades coming from Georgia and other states as well, aimed at, as they would see it, completing the territory that was promised, I guess you would say, to the state. And this puts them on a collision course with the Creek Nation, with the Cherokee Nation, because these are also lands that are guaranteed by treaties with the United States. And so you have a political demand by states like Georgia that this land should sooner or later become part of the state of Georgia, should be taken away from Native nations. But then you also have a promise, like repeated promises from the United States that this land is Cherokee land or Creek land, Muskogee land. And you have an obligation in those treaties on the part of the United States to help Creeks and Cherokees defend those lands. So what happens in the removal era is, or after the removal policy, you end up with a presidential administration in Jackson, and to some extent a Congress that is willing basically to ignore those treaty promises and to allow states like Georgia to create conditions of just absolute crisis for Native peoples, in the hope that Native peoples will then, Native leaders will then give up and agree to accept removal. So it's this sort of triangular politics, well, at the very least triangular, probably a few other dimensions in there, but the Cherokee Nation, the United States, and then state governments. And it's oftentimes state governments that are pushing the hardest, with the United States acting then as the power that's going to step in, negotiate removal treaties, and accomplish the deportation of Native Americans.
One of the things that you've done in your work that is so interesting is after this period that we're talking about, Native Americans are removed for most all intents and purposes, at least here in Georgia. I know there's a pretty strong band of the eastern band of the Cherokee still in western North Carolina, but here in Georgia. And I know, so whites swarm over this territory. We see the spread of African-American slavery into this, becomes part of the Cotton Kingdom in some ways, becomes an important part of the history of 19th century Georgia. But then one of the really interesting things about it is that Georgians also eventually began to embrace the idea of remembering and telling the story of what happened to the Cherokee. And it's always portrayed as a tragedy. It's always portrayed, as you've pointed out, as something to do with injustice and inequality. There's something that's just fundamentally unfair about this. And as you've said, Georgians really from the early part of the 20th century began to craft a narrative about this that changed in many ways over the course of the 20th century. My question to you is this: what is it about Native American history that white Georgians have been able to sort of embrace it, claim it as their own, and want to tell this story as one of injustice in a way that certainly has not been the case when it comes to slavery or Jim Crow or even civil rights? What is it about the Native story?
Well, I think what happens in a lot of Native American historical commemoration by non-Native communities, by settler communities, for lack of a better term, what's happening in a lot of it is that settler communities commemorate Native history. I see it as sort of a way of rooting themselves in places. I mean, it kind of comes back to that question of the importance of place. So by commemorating a Cherokee history in northern Georgia, for example, what they're doing is rooting themselves, placing themselves more firmly in this landscape in a former indigenous homeland. So I find the commemoration of Native American history, just sort of the use of Native American historical images in non-Native culture, at least in part, as a way of like reckoning with American places, with turning those places into homes for settler communities. And they're able to do this in part in a way that doesn't spark controversy because precisely because there's this assumption that Native Americans are gone. Cherokees, of course, aren't gone. I mean, there are Cherokee people and Cherokee descendants in Georgia all through this time. There's, you know, the Eastern Band and Cherokee communities here in Western North Carolina. But a lot of the culture starts with this assumption that Native Americans are gone. And as far as race is concerned in the South, it's this biracial landscape, right? It's a black-white landscape as opposed to something more complex. Because you have this assumption of Native American disappearance, it's permissible for settler communities to commemorate and even sort of, you know, quasi apologize for something like removal. And in doing so, these are rituals that help, I think, settler communities to become more at home in these former indigenous homelands. And so one of the most surprising things in my research was just to see the extent to which, like, removal commemoration didn't spark controversy, even during periods of time when states like Georgia were actively battling against, like, the Black freedom struggle, right? I mean, in the era of massive resistance, the state of Georgia is perfectly willing to commemorate removal at a place like the New Echota State Historic Site, and even frame that, as the state does in the early 1960s, as a kind of apology for the crimes of previous Georgia governments. Some of the Georgia politicians who support those commemorations are some of the people who are at the forefront of the massive resistance movement. So people like Marvin Griffin, right? And that's permissible, I think, because there's this assumption that there isn't, like, a Native American politics in Georgia in the 1960s. There's an assumption that Native American history in Georgia has ended in the 1830s, right? It ended with removal. And so that event is safe in a way that many other possible historical topics in Georgia history are not. And yeah, so it's a really interesting kind of dichotomy. Some of the same institutions and individuals who actively exclude African-American history from public history, from the public sphere, are very willing to embrace certain stories about the Native American past, even stories that would seem to place previous generations of Georgia political leaders in a very negative light.
So two-part follow-up to that, based upon what you just said. Is it possible to argue, and it may not be, that during the 60s, it's safer to see a Native American population that no longer lives here as almost being white because of the biracial politics going on with the civil rights movement? Do you see natives now becoming almost, at least in the terms of white people, the way they view natives? They're romanticizing their past, whatever they're doing, but somehow are they seeing them as more white than non-white? Is that why it's safer in some ways?
That's a good question. In terms of, like, the Georgia commemorations, there's probably a little bit of that insofar as they really play up this civilized tribe image. And that has, even though that image is basically tied to Cherokee resistance to states like Georgia and to the United States, it's an image that obviously is, when it's used by non-Indians, it's a very complimentary image towards the U.S. and towards Euro-American culture. So there's an element of that, I think, of those Georgia commemorations. And clearly what's going on when non-Native communities commemorate like the Cherokee Nation or the Cherokee struggle against removal, they're clearly identifying with Cherokees in that case, not identifying, they're not presenting themselves as the people who directly benefited from the deportation of Native Americans, right? Mm-hmm. They're saying that, oh, it's like a shame that happened back in the 19th century. And the commemoration forms a kind of apology or a recognition of that. But there isn't this, I mean, it's very clear that they're identifying with the Cherokees as people who loved these places in the way that white communities now love those places. And so there's a kind of possessiveness there. There's like a taking possession of Native American history and a transformation into Georgia heritage, like settler community heritage. So yeah, I mean, I think there's very clearly an attempt to identify with a group of people who previous generations of Georgia leaders and ordinary Georgia citizens had worked very, very hard to dispossess and destroy.
You talk, and you just mentioned that one of the reasons whites are able to embrace the narrative of commemoration is because natives are no longer here. They see them as gone.
Yeah.
How does or does the question of reparations ever enter into this here? And is that because it doesn't seem to, at least if it does, correct me and explain to our audience where it does, because what we hear about most of the time, very contentious, controversial subject of reparations is, does the United States now owe some kind of reparation to the descendants of former slaves? And what you hear people, usually white people, say, there are no slaves anymore. I never owned any slaves. There aren't, no one's been enslaved for 150 years. We're not going to talk about reparations. But there are obviously descendants of Cherokee people who lost their land, living still right here in Georgia, living in Western North Carolina. Is there any conversation afoot over reparations? And if there is, does that change the way that white people want to commemorate or even think about this subject that they've tended to romanticize?
So that's a really interesting question. In the commemorations themselves, there isn't really discussion. I mean, in like the early part of the 20th century, middle part of the 20th century, or even I think in a lot of ways in the present, there isn't this formal discussion of reparations. The commemoration, in a sense, the commemoration itself becomes the reparation, right? Which is important, right? Because a lot of this commemoration, it recognizes historical misdeeds, I guess you could say, on the part of like the state of Georgia, the United States, but it doesn't really require that much of settler communities in the present. But the other part of like the question of reparations is that in a really, really important sense, there's already, and for a long time has already been, a structure within American law for addressing the sort of historic disregard of things like treaties. Native Americans can pursue what you might call reparations, compensation, recompense for violations of old treaties. Both the Cherokee Nation and the Eastern Band in the early middle part of the 19th century successfully pursued recompense for violations of their treaties. So in this like nation to nation sense, this relationship, this political relationship between federally recognized Native American nations and the United States, there's already a structure there in place because of the treaty relationship for something that in a different conversation, a different context would look like reparations. The other thing I would say is that reparations or sort of responsibility in the present would logically take the form of non-native governments and non-native communities supporting the work of tribal sovereignty in the present. And so one of the things you do see in more recent commemorations that have been sponsored by or participated in by Native nations is an insistence that any sort of discussion of, say, removal in the early 19th century should be accompanied by first an insistence that those nations are still present. Those nations survived, they rebuilt, they continue to exist, not just as communities, but as part of the political landscape of the United States, but then to also put an emphasis on Native American sovereignty in the present. So that's not always easy to get into these discussions of heritage, but I think that's sort of the form, one of the forms in which talking about like responsibility in the present tied to these historical memories, that's one of the forms it should take.
One of the things, we've got a lot of ground to cover in the short time we have left, but there's a couple of things that you touch on, and I'm sort of flying ahead here. We tend to think of, and I found this fascinating, we tend to think of when we talk about, when white Georgians have commemorated this subject of removal of the Cherokee, they have tended to talk about it as an aberration, as a tragedy, as something that is almost set apart because it's so unfair, unequal, as you've described it. I want to read a quote from your book where you said, contemporary commemoration of the Trail of Tears tends to define Indian removal as a tragic error, an act of injustice that violated American principles of freedom and equality. That premise is certainly reasonable. However, defining removal as a mistake minimizes the significance of Native American dispossession to the history of the United States. You basically go on to say, if I can paraphrase you, without dispossession, not just in Georgia, but everywhere, there never would have been a United States. This wasn't a mistake. It was foundational to the creation of the United States.
Yeah, and so it's really both of those things, right? It's both a violation of American principles of equality and justice, but also, part of the foundation of the United States as a territorial entity, right? And so Americans tend to think of the United States as being founded on these Enlightenment principles that show up in like the Declaration of Independence, and that's true, of course, but it's also a physical thing, and it's a homeland that is made out of other people's homelands. It's a territory that's made out of other people's territories, and you can only forget the second part of that if you, as Americans often do, if you define the continent as like a wilderness or empty, or as as this sort of open land that's just simply available for Europeans as they show up, and those two things are not those two definitions of something like removal. They can't really be reconciled. They can only be held in tension, right? It's both a violation of American principles, but then also part of the foundation of the country. And so, yeah, the political landscape of the United States, the United States as a territory, would have to look very different if things like removal didn't take place.
One of the things that we often hear about today, that I guess is not necessarily about commemoration, but certainly one of the ways in which mainstream American culture has brought Native culture, if you want to call it that, really symbolism into the mainstream, is through the use of symbols in sports, right? We see it in the names of universities, in terms of professional athletes. The Cleveland Indians have recently changed their name going into next season as the Cleveland Guardians. Right here in Georgia, of course, our own Atlanta Braves came into a really bright spotlight a couple of weeks ago, winning the World Series, but once again, the tomahawk chop came in too. If you could talk about very briefly, not only the use of how that started, what it means for Americans to do that. What about the tomahawk chop? One of the questions we got from the public coming into this discussion that you and I are having right now is, how do you decide? Should we ask the Cherokee what they think, or the Creek or the Seminole what they think about that? And does that still enter into the equation? Does it matter? Is it good? Is it bad? What about options? Big question in a short amount of time.
Well, I mean, the answer to the question of whether like one should ask, I mean, the answer to that is definitely yes, but I mean, you're going to see like a diversity of opinions on
Right.
Native American mascots in Native communities as you would any place else.
Sure.
I think it's really whether you are in favor or opposed to mascots. I think at the very least, it's really important to acknowledge that those images come out of very old patterns of racial stereotyping of Native Americans that go back very, very deep in American history, and that are fundamentally tied to colonialism, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in terms of the Atlanta baseball team, I mean, they brought that name with them when they moved in the 1960s to Atlanta, as if I remember my baseball history correctly.
That's right.
And I'm guessing that when the team was back in the North, that name was probably first adopted like in the early 20th century. This is a time when there are all sorts of just romantic images of Native Americans circulating through the culture, many of which are rooted in some of the same assumptions we've already talked about, that Native Americans are disappearing, that they're gone. And the availability of those images to sports teams or universities is fundamentally rooted in colonialism. It's rooted in a culture that emerges out of the historical experience of dispossession and deportation and assimilation policies and all the rest. So whether you're okay with those mascots or not, I think just as a point of history, you have to start by acknowledging where they come from, and they come from colonialism. And a lot of the activities that sort of follow from the adoption of those mascots reflect, again, very old patterns of like non-Native Americans playing Indian, as the phrase goes, you know, sort of the putting on feathers, putting on face paint. Gosh, you know, you talk about the tomahawk chop, and, you know, the music that's used for that sort of thing comes right out of, you know, like 9 million bad Westerns from the early 20th century that in which, you know, the Native American characters were played by like Anthony Quinn. It taps into these like long traditions of, you know, racial stereotyping, and you can't really separate them. I don't think you can argue that, you know, in 2021 that you know, maybe that doesn't matter, or it shouldn't matter, or that we live in a different world now. You can argue back and forth about whether those mascots are acceptable now, but I think it's pretty indisputable about where those images come from. They come from these romantic racial stereotypes that are circulating and throughout the 19th century, and especially in the late 19th, early 20th century.
And while we're talking about it, you know, I'm white male, you're white male. We're talking about Native American history. Do you get any pushback from the Native American community near where you live about questioning your authority on this subject, or is that not an issue? Are you accepted as a specialist in the history of something that you're not?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's always an issue. I mean, it's always an issue for me. You know, as an academic, universities and academic structures aren't isolated from the political and racial history of the United States any more than any other institution, like baseball teams or whatever else are. And so in a very real way, I mean, my position is, you know, it's a reflect the, I mean, the term like privilege is becoming a bit of a cliche now, but it's an expression of privilege, right? I had, as a sort of middle class man, I had opportunities that, you know, traditionally have been denied to Native Americans, and so my ability to become someone who is supposedly is like, you know, an expert in this history that reflects, you know, colonialism as much as, you know, the Atlanta Braves mascot does. And it is an issue. I remember when I first arrived in Western North Carolina, being asked to teach Cherokee history classes, and I had the, you know, academic knowledge to do that, but I find myself in these, you know, in a Cherokee place, this ancient Cherokee place, a place where some of my students, you know, their ancestors had lived for thousands of years, and, you know, I'm in a classroom in which supposedly me, you know, supposedly I, you know, this newcomer, you know, this white dude from Chicago originally, I'm the one who supposedly, you know, is the expert. And one of the things, you know, teaching in this place has taught me is that, you know, Cherokee people don't need me to tell them their history, what their history is, right? And it would be utterly arrogant for me to do that. And that's affected how I teach. It's affected how I, you know, do my scholarship. If you think about most of what we've talked about here, in terms of like my own writing and research, it's Cherokee history, I suppose, but it's history of how Native American images and Native American memories, I guess you'd say, have circulated within a broader American culture. And that's a deliberate choice on my part. I mean, what I can contribute, I think, is, you know, in some ways, a critique of various representations of colonialism. I cannot and never claim to speak for Cherokee history in this kind of monolithic way. And as I say, I mean, Cherokee people don't need me to tell them what their history is. I mean, Cherokee people know the knowledge is there. The other thing I would add is part of how our institution, Western Carolina, has kind of responded, at least partly, to the colonial history of higher education, has been as much as possible to orient our Native American Studies programming and our initiatives toward a series of strategic partnerships with the Eastern Band, focused on things like Cherokee language, Native American health. And so what we really define what we're doing in Cullowhee as is sort of honoring a set of, ideally honoring a set of obligations between the university and, in a sense, the state of North Carolina, because we're a state school, set of obligations between the university, which occupies this ancient Cherokee place, and then the Eastern Band as a sovereign Native American nation. And so, yeah, it's always an issue, and it should be an issue, and it shouldn't necessarily be comfortable. It shouldn't be comfortable for me to act as if I'm, I simply speak for Cherokee history, because I don't, and wouldn't claim to be.
Real quick, what do you think, based upon your study of this subject as a public and academic historian, what is the proper way for us to commemorate and remember? I know that's a big question, this event and these people in Georgia and American history.
I'm pretty sure I don't give an answer to that in the book, but I think what the most interesting work going on today is rooted again in a set of partnerships between Native nations who never went away and broader commemorative communities, I guess you would say, whether those are white dominated or national institutions or state institutions. So I think the most important thing is for in this day and age, for Native nations, for Native communities to be the authors, or at least significant authors of this sort of work, and not have it be simply something that that settler communities undertake. Because in that sense, no matter how good the heritage work is, it becomes about the needs of non-Native communities as opposed to Native communities. So the most important thing is a power dynamic, I guess, just making sure that it is Native American communities that are directing these sorts of commemorations, that there's significant collaboration, partnership, and that the power dynamic within public history shifts towards Native nations and away from settler institutions.
Andrew Denson is a professor of history at Western Carolina University in Cullowhee, North Carolina. He's the author of numerous books and articles on Native history, including this one, Monuments to Absence, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2017, and winner of the Georgia Historical Society's Bell Award for the Best Book in Georgia History 2018. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate you bringing some light into a big subject.
Thank you very much. It was good talking with you.
If you want to know more about the Georgia History Festival, check out georgiahistoryfestival.org and georgiahistory.com for everything about the Georgia Historical Society. Thanks so much for joining us.